I think we're about ready to start now. I'm impressed you all came out on this cold, cold evening. And to welcome and give a warm Northwestern Ontario welcome to our authors who are probably fairly familiar with Northwestern Ontario winters if we go by their books. Hi everybody, I'm Lisa Lacko, host of Superior Morning on CBC Radio 1. And we're so glad you made it here this evening because it's such an exciting event for us. We've been talking about this for weeks. We couldn't believe we were lucky enough to have not one author, but two authors of the Canada Reads panel this year. So we've been very blessed with that. Now, Jane Urquhart is the author of Away. She represents Ontario in this year's regional breakdown of the Canada Reads battle, the turf wars they're calling it. And Richard Wagamese is the author of Indian Horse. He's representing British Columbia and the Yukon, which I don't quite understand because your roots are here in Northwestern Ontario. We won't tell the big Canada Reads people that in Toronto. Let me tell you a little bit about their roots here, though, in Northwestern Ontario. Jane was born in Little Long Lac, which is about 300 kilometers northeast of Thunder Bay. Richard Wagamese is an Ojibwe from Wabsumung First Nation, which is near Kenora. And, of course, both books are very much representative of Northwestern Ontario or life in Northern Ontario. So we're claiming both authors here this evening. We decided we wanted to bring them here tonight to see how their roots have influenced their writing. But before I tell you a little bit more about these two amazing authors, I should let you know, you've probably noticed the odd television camera here this evening. Shaw Cable is taking video of tonight's event to broadcast Friday, Saturday, and Sunday nights. So keep smiling and make them feel welcome as well. It's nice to have a partnership for this with the Shaw Cable here this evening. We're glad to have them. So let me tell you more about these wonderful people. Jane Urquhart and her book, Away. Jane, I spent probably the last week immersed in your book, and I loved it. It was just beautifully written. And she was born here in Northwestern Ontario, but she grew up in Toronto. We'll forgive her that. She was only 5 when her parents left Little Long Lac because her dad was in mining. So as with all mining families, you tend to move around a lot. But she did spend a great deal of time in Northern Ontario even after her family went down below. She currently lives in just northeast of Toronto in Northumberland County. Now, she is the internationally acclaimed author of 7 award-winning novels, 3 books of poetry, and many short stories. Her first novel, The Whirlpool, got her international recognition when she became the first Canadian to win France's Best Foreign Book Award. Now, in 1997, her 4th novel, The Underpainter, won the Governor General's Literary Award for Fiction. Now, Away, which was actually published back in 1993, and the book that's one of the finalists for this year's Canada Reads competition, won the Trillium Award and was also a international bestseller. The book was also one of the 6 finalists for the inaugural Dublin Impact International Literary Prize. And Jane is also an officer of the Order of Canada. Wow, that's what a list. No stranger to Thunder Bay either. A couple of years ago, she was here as part of the International Festival of Authors tour to read from and talk about her novel, The Underpainter, which of course is very much set in our neck of the woods. Now, let me tell you about Richard, no stranger to Northwestern Ontario as well, but he now lives in Kamloops, BC with his wife, who's here this evening, and his dog, who's not here this evening, I don't think. I didn't see him anywhere this morning. One of Canada's foremost Native authors and storytellers, Richard Wagamese, has been a professional writer since 1979. Now, he's got a very impressive body of work. Must have been only a child author at the time, were you? Includes 6 novels, a book of poetry, 5 nonfiction titles, including 2 memoirs, and an anthology of his newspaper columns. Now, back in 1991, he became the first Native Canadian to win a National Newspaper Award for column writing. His debut novel, Keeper and Me, back in 1994, won the Alberta Writer Guild's Best Novel Award. He's twice won the Native American Press Association Award for his journalism, and he's also received the George Riga Award for Social Awareness in Literature for his 2011 memoir, One Story, One Song. Now, he was also awarded the Canadian Authors Association Award for Fiction in 2007 for his 3rd novel, Dream Wheels. Most recently, Richard was honored with the 2012 Aboriginal Achievement Award for Media and Communications. So between them, a lot of words, a lot of memories, a lot of awards, and we're thrilled to have them here this evening. If we could please give them a warm Northwestern Ontario welcome. With emphasis on the warm, I think, this evening. Now, what we've asked them to do here this evening to kind of get the evening started is to pick a passage from the nominated books. And we're going to start with Jane. Now, I'm sure you've all read Away, which is, because it's been around for 20 years now. Can you believe that, Jane? 20 years? But here's a synopsis. Let me just give you the Coles Note version of this. It tells the history of an Irish family in Canada. Now, Esther OMalley Robertson is the last occupant of her family's homestead in Ontario. And she's being forced out by this limestone quarry that's getting closer and closer. And she relates the 140-year history that brought her family, well, from the very inhospitable shores of Ireland at the time during the potato famine. And it's just how you've told the story of that potato famine is incredible, to the challenging realities of the Canadian Shield, trying to plant in the Canadian Shield. I'll remember that. It's shot with Irish mythology. Now, Away also vividly depicts the 19th century pioneer life in settlements in Ontario at the time of Canadian Confederation. Part of it is set on a Great Lake. Not Superior, but, well, certainly the landscape we can all identify with. I was sure it was Lake Superior. So, Jane, if you could please, we'd love to hear you select a passage from Away. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I should say that my novel, The Underpainter, is set on Lake Superior. So there you go. I'll read a little passage that has to do with forest life, and I think that that should be some kind of reflection of what we're talking about here tonight. We're talking about how the forest affects people. I think I'm getting a bit of an echo. Is that okay? Yeah. And how landscape affects not just people, but also narrative, I believe, and storytelling and writing and all of that. I'm just going to read a couple of pages concerning a young boy who has only recently moved into what was essentially a wilderness landscape with his family, who are people from Ireland, as Lisa stated. In the weeks that followed, Liam spent the days squatting between the house and the barn, sulking and drawing lines in the dry mud with a stick, while inside his mother bent over the baby, the new baby, the fire, and wept. Her loom was silent, her spinning wheel still, until one morning Liam entered the kitchen and saw that there was color in her face and a brightness in her eyes. She was packing a bread and butter basket for his father, who would leave that afternoon with the pathmaster. Liam wondered whether or not his father might be taking the new baby with him on his journey, and pictured quiet days spent alone with his mother. But his father laughed and said that he had not the equipment with which to feed it, and his mother laughed too and embraced him. That night, Liam's mother taught him lullabies, singing them in both Irish and English. Dusk is drawn and the green man's thorn is ringed in wreaths of fog, they sang together, and slumber from the dark world comes to hold the world in thrall. Then she showed him how to change the soiled cloth that was wrapped between his sister's legs. Shyly, Liam told her about the great white house and asked her if she remembered it. When she said she did not, he announced that one day it would be his, and he would bring her with him to live in it. "And what of your baby sister?" his mother asked. "Will she be invited as well? Will you look after her?" Liam was silent. He looked at the small fists curled like snails inside the cradle. "Surely it is in you to look after small Eileen," his mother said softly. "Yes," he said, wanting to please. "It's in me to look after her." The next morning, when Liam's dreams were pierced by the infant's voice, he rolled over and looked across the room. His mother's bed was vacant, the coverlet pulled across it smoothly, as if she had not slept there the night before, or as if no one had ever been there at all. His father was gone, his mother was gone. The day was bright and clear, though the low November sun threw the shadow of the forest wall a great distance, until in the middle of the afternoon it covered both the barn and the cabin. The boy spent most of the day in the sun, just beyond the house. In these spaces, he believed he was still connected with his home, could place his hand on the edge of the shadow of the roof, but was also separate enough to ignore the baby's crying. By the time the sun was blocked entirely by the forest, silence had fallen inside the cabin. At first, he had not allowed the idea of his mother to enter his mind at all, but as the day darkened and the increasing wind set her solitary white apron flapping on a string tied between two saplings, he called her name once, and without waiting for a reply, ran toward the forest and peered into the gloom. Standing entirely still, he saw birds dart and chipmunks leap, and when he had remained frozen at attention for some time, a female deer sauntered with her fawn across his line of vision, not 10 yards away. It was not his mother. "I am 7, he whispered, thinking for the first time of his age. At twilight, he turned his back to the eastern trees and walked toward the log structures, feeling terribly the chill of the approaching evening. Inside, night had already arrived, and Liam had no skills with which to combat it, and none to combat the hunger that had quite suddenly attacked his belly. Eventually, he found a bucket of water near the door and a crust of bread on the table. He ate and drank warily, uncertain as to whether or not he might be punished. Then he groped his way through the cabin's objects until he recognized the soft skin of candles, and he held them, one in each hand, for at least an hour, willing them to produce light. The baby had begun to cry again, so the boy crawled back and forth across his father's basswood floor until his hand brushed the pointed end of one of the cradle's rockers, and he pumped it fiercely up and down, attempting to achieve silence. He heard the thud of the small body hitting the sides of the interior as the wailing increased in intensity. Digging his fists into his ears, he shouted what he could remember of the lullabies his mother had taught him, until magically a slim bar of light appeared on the table before the window. He staggered across the width of the cabin to the door and out into a world of icy wind and moonlight. It was then that he saw his mother, or what he would later in his dreams call his mother, slipping in and out among the pines on the opposite side of the stream, as she had sometimes done in playful moments during their happy summer, making a game of it. Her form appeared and disappeared, multiplied, then reduced itself. The moon was a huge ball thrown by her into the sky, and the boy stretched his arms upwards gleefully for a couple of moments before he ran towards her, laughter bubbling out of his lungs and over the dark field. As he approached, she withdrew behind the cedars and spruce where the thick black erased her. Liam crept away across scrub chalky with moonlight and frost, humiliated. Then he half turned and saw the multiple versions of her, straight and thin and white. His blood thundered in his ears at the sight of the many hers, one for him, one for his father, one to silence the baby. And he was running again toward the stream. Dark boughs moved up and down like huge wings across the bodies of these women. Liam stopped short. His vision changed. He ran his hands in agitation back and forth across his homespun sleeves. "White birches," he said aloud, using the name his father had taught him, and repeating it, his voice a high song no one heard. Just white birches, white birches. Thank you.
Takes you there, doesn't it? And that's such a compelling part of the story where the next phase of life begins for Liam and his little sister. Oh, I wish I could write like that. Thank you very much, Jane. Now we're going to hear from Richard Wagamese. Now, his latest novel deals with a young boy, Saul Indian Horse. When the book opens, he's an alcoholic Ojibwe man who finds himself very reluctantly in an alcohol treatment center after his latest binge. So he has to come to peace with himself, and he has to tell his story. And he has a difficult time articulating his story, so he writes it down. And he tells it to the person in the room as well, the one-on-one. He takes readers on this, well, a very often difficult journey through Saul's life, from his painful forced separation from his family and land, where he's then sent to a residential school to, well, the very brief salvation he finds in playing hockey. Now, the novel is very much an unflinching portrayal of the harsh reality of life in 1960s Canada, specifically right here in Northern Ontario, where, well, racism reigned at the time, and Saul's spirit is destroyed by the alienating effects of cultural displacement. Richard, if we can ask you, please, to read from your novel, Indian Horse. Thank you.
Nice to be home. Thank you. And I'm glad to see so many people. It's cold out there. Minus 37. And without the fur-lined underwear, wouldn't be possible. So some things cultural stay strong. Indian Horse is a novel that I've often said was about residential schools, redemption, and hockey. And it's also a novel that's very much about Canada. It's also a novel that's very much about finding the truth of the nature of that country that we all call home. And it's about looking at all aspects of our story as individuals and as communities and as nations. And I think I've discovered through my own investigations of my own trauma that it's absolutely necessary for individuals to look at their entire history, even the bleaker and darker parts, in order to be able to come to grips with it, in order to be able to embrace it again, and especially in order to be able to let it go and to move on to something bigger and better and brighter and more evolutionary. And this is what Saul Indian Horse does in the course of the novel Indian Horse. And of course, in the beginning, it's very, very much about residential schools and that entire process of institutionalization. And in that sense, it's a really harrowing, dark, and hard story. And I wondered how I could temper that, how I could find a way to deliver that harsh story in a way that wouldn't alienate people, but instead allow them to kind of breathe it and live it. And the passage I want to read to you is about what those children really lost. The big question is, what did they really lose? And this section talks about that. One afternoon, during some rare unsupervised time, a dozen of us escaped to the bottom of the ridge the school sat on. A small creek ran along the base of the ridge, curving up out of an inkpot lake and into a larger one. The creek was narrow, maybe 3 feet across, and shallow. It was a sucker creek. The fish swam up at the spawn in the bigger water, and we went down there with burlap bags we'd taken from the barns. We could see the fish pushing up the water. It was thrilling. So much life, so much desperation, so much energy. We stood for a long time and just watched. Then some of us cut saplings and bent them around the inside lip of those sacks. We lowered the sacks into the water and pulled them up dripping and filled with fish. We watched the silvery brown flash as they flopped up onto the bank, their puckered mouths flapping like wet kisses from fat aunties, their tails flipping and slapping against the ground. We pushed them back into the water and pulled up another sack. We did that 4 times. The 4th time we stood quietly, each of us lost in our thoughts as the fish struggled for air, for life, for freedom. When we bent finally and took the fish in our hands to set them back into the water, most of us were crying. We turned as a group and began the long, sloping walk back up the ridge to the school. We walked with our hands cupped around our noses, breathing in the smell of those fish, pushing the slime of them around on our faces. We had no knives to clean them, flay them. We had no fire to smoke them over. We had no place to store them, no way to keep them. When they lay gasping on the grass, it was ourselves we saw fighting for air. We were Indian kids, and all we had was the smell of those fish on our hands. We fell asleep that night with our noses pressed to our hands. And as the days went by and the smell of those suckers faded, there wasn't a one of us that didn't cry for the loss of the life we'd known before. When the dozen of us cried in the chapel, the nuns smiled, believing it was the promise of their God that touched us. But we all walked out of there with our hands to our faces, breathing in, breathing in. I saw kids die of tuberculosis, influenza, pneumonia, and broken hearts at St. Jerome's. I saw young boys and girls die standing on their own 2 feet. I saw runaways carried back frozen solid as boards. I saw bodies hung from rafters on thin ropes. I saw wrists slashed and a cascade of blood on the bathroom floor, and one time, a young boy impaled on the tines of a pitchfork that he'd shoved through himself. I watched a girl calmly fill the pockets of her apron with rocks and walk away across the field. She went to the creek, sat on the bottom, and drowned. That would never stop, never change, so long as that school stood in its place on the top of that ridge, as long as they continued to pull Indian kids from the bush and from the arms of their people. So I retreated. That's how I survived, alone. When the tears threatened to erupt from me at night, I vowed that they would never hear me cry. I ached in solitude. What I let them see was a quiet, withdrawn boy, void of feeling.
Wow. I'm just going to let that sink in for a moment. Those are powerful, powerful words from both of our authors here this evening. Thank you. That has been indeed an honor to hear you both choose a selection from your book to share with us here this evening. It's been an amazing experience. So now it's your turn. All of you came here this evening to say hello to Richard and Jane and welcome them back home, as it were. And so we have, I know you probably have some questions about how they write, why they write, what moves them to write, any number of questions about perhaps what Northwestern Ontario means to them, maybe what a cold winter means to them, because that was certainly present in both books as well. Now, as you can see here in the middle, rising mysteriously, is this microphone. We need you to speak into that because, as we've mentioned a little earlier, we're recording this with Shaw Cable, who are going to be playing it back. And for posterity, would like to hear your questions. So if you've got questions, if you've been mulling over parts of this book, feel free to line up there and we'll call you one by one to ask your questions. And you can also, because we're so technically up to speed these days, you can tweet us your questions. Isn't that the coolest thing ever? Superior AM Lisa is where you can send the tweets. The hashtag is Canada Reads. So for all of you BlackBerry, iPhone, Android people out there, feel free to go at it that way as well. Now, I'd like you to ask when you come to that microphone, maybe what I'll do is I'll start off the questions, because what I'm curious, when I read both your books, I think there's so many similarities in your stories and in terms of being in touch with your ancestors and speaking to the generations that come afterwards. That was one part that was a nice common theme in both books. But one thing that struck me was winter, and how you both described winter in Ontario, specifically Northern Ontario as well. And maybe what I can ask, Jane, first of all, when I ask you about Northern Ontario winters, describe it for me.
Well, I was saying today, actually, to a couple of people that what I remember was days like today. When you wake up in the morning and the sky was so astonishingly blue, and the snow was so beautifully white, and in spite of the fact that it was 103 below zero, you felt you wanted to be out there, which is not something that happens, trust me, in southern Ontario. You're not drawn out into winter in southern Ontario in the same way as I feel when I'm here. I love this kind of weather. I know it sounds insane, but it's absolutely true. And I do remember all of that because I was put outside as a very young child. I remember to be aired in the 70 below zero temperatures of up there, and you know, farther north than here even. But I also remember that my mother she had this terrible fear that in spite of the fact that it was 50 below zero, that I would fall through the ice on the lake. And so she had kind of penned me in. I was also I was a bolter too, I have to admit. And she said that there was a big snow fence around the area where I was, you know, bundled up and sent out to play, and that she used to stand in the kitchen listening to me while I dug a tunnel under the snow fence saying, "Don't do it, Jane. Bad girl. Don't do it." And quite frankly, I've been doing that ever since.
Richard, if I could ask you to describe Northern Ontario winters, tell me what first comes to mind for you.
What comes to mind for me right off the top of the bat is those marvelous outdoor rinks that were everywhere when I was a kid, and they had chicken wire around the end of them, and boards that had probably stood there for 30 or 40 years, and some of them had great big gouges in them and places where skate blades had gone through, and you came out of the shack, which was built of plywood, and it had a really, really thin metal stove in there that they stoked so it was 180 degrees inside, and the heat in those shacks I describe as orange heat, because not only did it look like that, because the metal was that hot, it was vibrating and waving in orange, but it felt that way on your body. It was so warm that it felt like you were turning orange. And then you get your equipment on and your skates done up, and I was a small kid, about 5 and a half, 6 years old, and I clumped across the rubber mat that they had on the floor, out the door, and then the ramp that led to the skating surface. You could hear the thuds on every time your foot fell because it was hollow underneath, and you finally got a blade on the ice for the first time, and the sound of that frosty crackle when that metal cut through the ice was just sharp and resonant. I can hear it right now. And then you started moving forward and moving your blades, and you could hear the cut and the swish and the slide of that metal, and you had to reach over and open the gate to get on the ice, and there was always that really thick metal bar. You had to lift up off the latch and pull it open, and it always creaked really, really loudly because it was amplified by the cold. There was great clouds of breath coming out of your nostrils, and it was freezing on your top lip. And if you were really lucky, it was cold enough that your nostrils actually froze together. So you had to put a gloved hand up there and push against it so you'd open up your nostrils again so you could breathe to skate, and then you'd hit the ice. And it would be marvelous because it was magical. And in Indian Horse, I talk about the shining white glory of a rink, and that's what it was. It's just out there in all that crystal fog. The sun would be behind a big bank of crystal clouds, so it looked like a mazy yellow eye shining through. And you're this little kid with an oversized hockey stick pushing that around, and all you can hear is cut, 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 and you drop a puck and bang it against the boards, and you hear that great big delicious thump, and you lost all worry about whether it was minus 170.
I didn't have that experience.
Because you were having fun, and you know that you could walk back into the orange heat again and be okay.